Welcome to today's morning bulletin. Myself, Matt Addison and James Martin here with you today to have a bit of a chat about Fabio Carvalho. Liverpool are very close to completing a deal for the Fulham man for an initial £5 million fee, with a couple more million or so in add-ons, as well as a 20% sell-on clause. They very nearly signed him in January, James, until that deal broke down. Liverpool just about left it too late to get it done then, but I suppose then it should be no surprise at all that they've gone back for him, and it does look like this is going to be one for the summer. They're going to get it done.
Yeah, it looks that way, which is good news. I suppose the only worry when it didn't get done in January was that there was that kind of awkward window where clubs in Europe could negotiate freely directly with the player, whereas Liverpool still had to go through Fulham rules about free agents in terms of from the same country that Liverpool are based in. It's harder to do essentially. But yeah, they'd been negotiating with Fulham in January, like you say, so no surprise that those negotiations have just been continuing at a more leisurely pace behind the scenes without that kind of looming deadline. And yeah, I imagine this deal that's been struck is essentially the same to the kind of bare bones that was sketched out back in January.
Yeah, not quite done yet, but Liverpool have been kind of negotiating this over the past few weeks. Personal terms done, medical done, I believe. So it's very, very close. And you mentioned there the kind of the concern really was that other clubs around Europe, and we know that Real Madrid and various clubs in other countries were interested, several more in this country as well. I think Tottenham, Chelsea, Manchester United were all sort of taking a look. But how much of this do you think has come down to the kind of relationship with Fulham, really? I mean, normally when a transfer breaks down last minute, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be resurrected so easily and so quickly. But obviously, Nico Williams went the other way, and there's a few sort of interesting elements to this. I think the fact that Liverpool have got it done, having already had it broken down, we've seen it a couple of times in the past, but I think that's interesting in itself as well.
Yeah, definitely. That Nico Williams move looked like a smart piece of business at the time. I mean, there was some talk about, we've sent them and we've got no one in return. Have we just been, had off here, sort of giving them Williams as part of an eventual agreement over Carvalho, and then that move breaks down at the last minute. There was talk that maybe we've been played a little bit. Loans are easier to sort at the deadline than permanent moves. But I think the reality was never that. It was more just a kind of longer term gesture of, like you say, the relationship between the two clubs. The fact that we were happy to loan them Williams, who has been very good for them, helping in the promotion push. It can't have hurt the relations. And yeah, even if the move for Carvalho was delayed a little bit, as you say, it looks close to being completely resurrected now. And yeah, it's a good club to build those ties with. I saw a tweet yesterday actually in terms of who their academy have produced in recent times. Obviously, Liverpool very familiar with Harvey Elliott and soon to be with Fabio Carvalho, but there's a couple more doing well for themselves, in England and abroad. So it's a sort of underrated production line of talent there in the last few years. So I think, that Williams move, not only to ingratiate themselves with Fulham for the sake of Carvalho, but also for any potential future targets, was a shrewd piece of business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we say, we expect this one to go through. It's not quite done, but it's pretty much there. I think that the fact that these stories are coming out now suggests that Liverpool are pretty confident of it. I think I'm pretty confident that he's going to go into the first team squad straight away as well. I know there was a couple of reports suggesting that there was no intention from Liverpool to sort of send him out on loan next season, which I suppose he's slightly older than one or two of these kind of younger players that Liverpool have brought in. You mentioned Harvey Elliott there. He was, 16 when Liverpool brought him in? Obviously 19, Fabio Carvalho, possibly even 20 by now. I'm not too sure. But he's a couple of years older, isn't he? He's that little bit more experienced. I think he's played about 31 times this season. So you'd probably expect him to go into the first team squad straight away. Not necessarily the first 11, but I'd imagine he's going to kind of be in that position.
Yeah, you'd think so. We've just been informed by the man behind the scenes that he's 19 and he's 20 in August. So if anyone's interested, it's one of them where you'd imagine he'd be in and around the first team. Like you say, it's not like he's going to be playing week in, week out, but he is further along that developmental path than someone like Elliott was when he came in. If Liverpool had struck a deal in January, by all accounts, he was going to be loaned back to Fulham for the remainder of the season. So that's good for Liverpool in the sense that they've not really lost anything by delaying the deal. They wouldn't have had him in any way. And of course, with Diaz through the door in January, that we already had that kind of player who could sort of revitalise the charge for the title, and of course on other fronts as well. So yeah, I mean, the delay didn't really cause any harm. If it does get done, then yeah, I think the plan will be to have him involved. It's so hard because it's such a good squad at the moment. It's like, well, where does this guy break in? But that there is at least the sort of versatility he brings. He's played in the front three. He's played more withdrawn in midfield. You imagine he's probably being slated for one of those midfield berths, just in terms of. I mean, there's so many attackers right now. We've been talking a lot about who's going to play in the Manchester City game. We did that on yesterday's morning stream, and it's a tough choice to say the least. So to throw another exciting attacker in the mix, I mean, we saw with Elliott, who came in with such a high reputation, and even he was essentially shunted backwards into the midfield for better chances of game time. So yeah, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Carvalho follow a similar route. But I mean, it's not like there's no problems back there either, because then you've got him competing with Elliott himself. You've got Curtis Jones, who's still a bright prospect, and that's before we've mentioned the sort of more established names in there. You've got Henderson, you've got Thiago, you've got Naby Keita, who's having a bit of a resurgence. So yeah, it's not going to be easy for him, but I do think, given the outlay and given the determination to resurrect this transfer, Liverpool do have first team plans for him sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think there's two interesting elements, isn't there, in terms of that pathway 2 minutes. One is the position. One is sort of who might leave the club in the summer. Let's do the position first. Obviously, for Fulham, a 4-2-3-1, he tends to play as a number 10, which we know Liverpool haven't done that for a long time. Probably not going to do that for a long time. Even if they did, there might be one or two players that would be ahead of him in that kind of position. So, as you say, he can play kind of as an 8. He could play maybe wide on the left or right of a front three. I wonder if there's a bit of a false 9 in him as well. The fact that he's played as a number 10, obviously, Roberto Firmino has done that in the past in previous clubs, done a bit of it for Liverpool as well. I just think that there might be a bit of that, but also the Harvey Elliott kind of, maybe he's not got the pace to play wide, so let's bring him back and play him in midfield. I think there's a couple of different ways. It'll be interesting to see probably what Jurgen Klopp does with him to begin with, whether that's the same thing as well that he does straight away that is the long-term plan. It could just be that he plays a few of these positions and that's how he gets his minutes.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of that recently in terms of players having to be flexible where they play in terms of getting those minutes. I mean, Jota, when he came in, you'd have said, where's the place for him in the team? Because the front three was so established, but he's popped up all across that front three, and by impressing in all of those positions, he's essentially nailed down a place as well. Almost, he had almost nailed down a place as a starter. Maybe that's up in the air again now. But yeah, it's kind of the way these days. No one, I mean, apart from 2 or 3 positions, there's no one who's fully nailed down really. So if you are looking to break into the team, you are going to need to be prepared to pop up in a few places. But yeah, I think the false 9 shout is interesting. Carvalho had a sort of sneaky Premier League debut before Fulham went down, which is sort of easy to forget. And his pressing numbers from that game were through the roof. It's obviously very small sample size. The numbers are slightly harder to come across in the Championship, but just in terms of watching clips of him and things like that, it looks like he definitely has that sort of aspect to his game, which of course is a key facet of being a false 9, almost anywhere, but particularly for a Klopp side. But yeah, I mean, an interesting thing about the positional question as well is, the kid's 19 and, Klopp's only going to be around potentially for another year or two. So it's just like, well, who knows what formation will be deployed a couple of years down the line. Maybe that 10 role will be resurrected at Liverpool. There's just no way of saying.
Yeah, it's something Steven Gerrard's used, hasn't he? I think a few times. Certainly at Rangers, he was a 4-2-3-1 man, so that could be potentially interesting. But that is looking a long way down the line. I suppose not that long, is it? But let's kind of keep it for one a little bit later on down the line. In terms of the other element, then, in terms of the sort of minutes in the more immediate term for Fabio Carvalho, I suppose is the exits. You're looking at a fairly bloated squad already for Liverpool this season. We expect that to be trimmed down a little bit ahead of next year. I think the fact that Liverpool have gone for Fabio Carvalho, who can play maybe in midfield, maybe in attack, that probably leaves a bit of a question mark. We knew there was a question mark already over James Milner, but possibly now I'm thinking Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain. Could that be a decision that's kind of been made for him, even Takumi Minamino. I mean, obviously we know Divock Origi is going to leave, but if you've got a player who can play maybe that kind of sixth forward role and he can play in midfield, I wonder what knock-on effect that has for Minamino as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Oxlade-Chamberlain, when he came off against Nottingham Forest, he looked extremely frustrated. Sort of cut a figure. Who knows? There's probably only limited chances left, particularly this season. I think a lot depends on the market in the summer. If there's no one coming in with a bid that Liverpool find acceptable, then I'm sure they'll be happy to keep him around for another year. We saw it with Origi. I mean, by all accounts, there was some kind of bids on the table, or at least interest, which Liverpool just weren't countenancing because they weren't meeting their value. So that we're not going to let Oxlade-Chamberlain go for ridiculously cut price fee. But you do feel that with, like you say, that slightly bloated squad now, if there is sufficient and appropriate interest, he might be one who's allowed to go. Minamino is more of an interesting one. It's very hard because he's had such a good season. I mean, it's sort of gone under the radar a little bit because it's mostly been limited to the cups. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of what squad depth is about, to have those kind of players who can pop up and make telling contributions. Would Liverpool be still in this position of chasing a quadruple into April without him? I mean, probably not, realistically. So you don't want to be too harsh on him. But I mean, the flip side of that is maybe he has built a bit of a market for himself. Maybe this is the time to cash in. I mean, Liverpool, again, to go back to Origi, they maybe missed the window to get good money for him and perhaps want to learn that lesson with Minamino, who is not necessarily as young as he could be. I think he's a year older than Origi, actually, which is somewhat surprising. Certainly he's a similar age anyway. But yeah, it's a tough call. I think a lot of it is dependent on the market. But yeah, Carvalho would give Liverpool options in terms of cashing in on a couple of those potentially surplus to requirements assets.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an exciting addition to the Liverpool squad, to say the very least. And I'd be surprised as well if that was the last of their business in the summer. But plenty more football to play, of course, before then, including the huge game with Manchester City on Sunday. We'll have Jurgen Klopp's press conference for you very shortly. We'll be previewing the game at the Etihad with the Blood Red podcast later this afternoon as well. For now, though, I think that's all we've got time for. So from James Martin and myself, Matt Addison, we'll see you very soon.